here's how this debate will proceed. Patrick Condon will go first. We'll have 12 minutes to lay out his views. Jarrett Walker will go second, with 12 minutes to lay out his views. Each will then have 3 minutes to rebut or respond to what his opponent in this debate has to say, and then the remainder of the time will be for your questions and comments. So with that, please welcome Patrick Condon.
Thank you, Robert. It's good to be back in Portland again. I've been here a number of times, and it's always been a great experience for me. The last time, one of the last times was the debate that Robert referred to, and that was great, but that was a while ago, and that was about 8, 9, 10 years ago. And since that time, it's really great to see that my side of the debate has been victorious. And I expect nothing less today. So I've actually become a little bit known for a book called 7 Rules for Sustainable Communities. And one of the rules in that is called Restore the Streetcar City. So at the core of this debate is probably my enthusiasm for that concept. The other thing to say is that I'm not a transportation planner, I'm not a transportation anything. I'm basically not anything at all. I've developed a career becoming what's considered an expert in sustainable communities, which means you know a little bit about everything. So you're about a mile wide and an inch thick in any particular discipline. So that gives me a different perspective on things, and what I like to explain is I'm not interested in transportation. I'm interested in the survival of our cities and our planet. So my work is mostly about what kind of city is going to help us survive as a species, as a nation, as a people, my grandchildren in the future, and what does that city look like. So I'm definitely in the range of 40 to 50 years out in the future. I'm not at all interested in 10-year span, I'm interested in the 50-year span. So I got a lot of slides to go through in just a few minutes. So, Robert? So this is what we find ourselves confronted with globally. I'm going to start off with the global view and then drill down into the local view. So we're in the midst of the greatest worldwide migration from the country to the city ever known, and likely never to be repeated. By 2050, 80% of all people on the globe are going to be living in cities. Next. So this is accompanied by rural abandonment. It's tragic, but it seems unavoidable. It's something that's happening in Oregon and Oklahoma next. It's happening even in China and Asia, unbelievably. Everybody flooding to the cities next. At the same time, our own cities grow, sometimes in this form, which we may not find appealing, but it certainly is familiar. Next. And other times in this form, which is a much more complex iteration of the urban situation, but whatever the form, 8 billion people are going to be in cities by 2050, and that's over 4 billion more than there are now. So we're going to look at a doubling of the population on average of cities around the globe by 2050, 2060. Next. Curiously, this is all happening at the same time that women are deciding not to have any children. And they're making that decision, it seems, to correlate almost precisely when they move into cities. Next. And this is not happening just in North America, it's happening all around the world. This is a kind of uncelebrated, unnoticed, huge wave of change which is happening right now. It's only sub-Saharan Africa which is lagging behind, but the trend lines are quite obvious. That the whole world is going to what's called a fertility rate, odd word, of around 2, and 2.1 fertility rate is replacement level. So what that says is that somewhere around 2050, the world will reach its peak population-wise and then begin to decline according to the UN's median scenario. This is, of course, unless something else gets us first, like radical disruptions of climate change, or a plague of Ebola or something like that. This is if we're lucky. Next. So on average, this means that by 2060, on average, our cities will not grow anymore. The cities we are building now are the ones that will last a long, long time. Then this becomes really important, critical time, particularly for those of you out there in the audience who are in their 30s and 40s rather than like me in your 60s. Next. Here's the other crushing phenomenon, though, that's recently become quite a concern to me, and that's during the same period, the middle class as we know it will vanish. Next. A lot of people are talking about this problem. Even President Obama in the UN just 2 days ago talked about the accumulation of wealth at the level of the 1%, and he didn't identify this as a problem of the West, he identified it as a problem of the world, giving more time to the issue of inequality than almost anything else. This guy here is the one who has done the most work on it, and the most popular work, Thomas Piketty. Next. Basically what his argument is that when global GNP, or national GNP for that matter, shrinks below 5%, which is trending all over the world, it means that all money ends up, eventually, all wealth, all capital wealth ends up in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals. I don't have time to go into the mathematics of that, but it's a really frightening bit of algebra. Next. Next. Next.
Pause your timer.
Okay. And there's some alarming graphs, and just to move very quickly along, this is one of them which shows that there was an interregnum where we actually had a middle class that was roughly between the end of World War I and now, and that middle class is vanishing. Next. What is also emerging at the same time is that there seems to be two different kinds of cities emerging during this period of, shall we say, late capitalism. The first one is the concentrated, next. And then there's the dispersed. About half of the new population is going into these concentrated cities like the ones in China. The other half are going into these dispersed cities like this one, or I call it the flat city, which will be the title of my next book. Go to Amazon.com and reserve a copy of it. The next book will be Flat City. The North American version of the flat city we can call the streetcar city. Next. And how it appears in Portland, Oregon. Next. So the flat city and the concentrated city are different in many respects, but you can see the list. Big moves versus small moves, master plan versus incremental, slow big changes versus rapid small changes, and so forth. Next. Oddly enough, I think that in my business, when we look at the issue of sustainable communities, this is the image that is always presented. People feeding ducks, women walking the dog with their yoga pants on, biking happily through a verdant landscape with some piece of high technology as the transportation mode. Next. And actually in Vancouver, we're pursuing this dream with a vengeance. The city has committed itself completely to the creation of this high-tech, sustainable utopia in their terms. Next. But as the slide said, it's a form, can you go back? Is it possible to go back? It's a form that people making $45,000 a year can't afford. And that appears to be what people with college educations and master's degrees, at least in the city of Vancouver, and I think it's not too much different here, are able to afford. It's a city form that's completely out of reach. Next. So, we have this image of Vancouver as orbit city, which seems almost realized, but these other global conditions are making it impossible. Next. So really, which should we pursue? The one on the left, which is a streetcar city vision where housing is $150 a square foot, and it has affordable infrastructure, or the one on the right, which has housing at $400 a square foot and unaffordable infrastructure. Next. Because at the same time, our millennials in both our countries, Canada and the United States, are being priced out of the market in a way that's making them enthusiastic about the kind of housing that's shown on the right. However, in its manifestation of a cultural condition, it's not all that different than the kinds of housing solutions that we've had in other parts of the world for a long time. Next. So it's become so bizarre that we're actually celebrating this reduction in circumstances with catalogs from IKEA to show you how wonderful it is to live in these small micro units. Next. And that's the actual description from the catalog. It says you don't really need a table, you don't even need chairs, you can just eat on the floor, kind of like your dog. Next. At UBC, we're also doing this. If you like micro units, you have 300 square feet. You're really going to love nano units at 170 square feet. That's hyper cool. This is literally what they're selling to our students, and they're renting them out at 3 times the going rate per square foot as compared with the already unaffordable nearby Kitsilano. Next. So this is what? You sleep there. Next. You work there. Then you say, where's my notebook? Can you go back one? There it is. Next. Next. I've written about this a fair amount. This is one of them. But this concentrated city urban design thinking has contributed to the radical economic housing injustice and generational conflict. We are actually in Vancouver creating a city, and I don't want you all from your cities to follow in our footsteps, because Vancouver is often seen as a model of intergenerational conflict and absolutely unaffordable housing for our citizens. Next. There are alternatives. This is the kind of thing you want to know what the solution is. In the city of Vancouver, I would espouse that the existing housing stock in the large geographic areas of RS1 zone could be transformed. It's not a utopian idea because this has been, we've already changed RS1, which is so-called single-family zones, to allow for 3 dwelling units per lot. Next. But unfortunately, this is the dream we're pursuing, this George Jetson orbit city dream, and shows our transit system. And next. The problem with it is that the price of its delivery, it can never reach very many people in walking distance. So most of the white areas are still committed to the car, unfortunately. Next. And what they do as a consequence is come up with these transit-oriented districts, which we've all been doing for generations now as an attempt to do something about the auto orientation of our landscape. But it's an extremely expensive solution, susceptible to all kinds of not just cost problems, but also earthquake problems as well. Next. Expensive to build homes and fragile buildings connected by unaffordable transit. Next. I think I'm running out of time. But we really don't need to do that, because the great benefits in terms of this indicator of vehicle miles traveled come at around 50 dwelling units per hectare, or about 20 dwelling units per acre. And when you get these eruptions of high density, they don't really do much good. Next. So this is the reality. Next. And one of the examinations was this one, which looked at, in this George Jetson model on the left, they want to build a subway all the way out to UBC at a cost of around $4 billion now. What would happen if we use the same money to restore the streetcar city using a more affordable Cambino tram from Siemens at $30 million per kilometer? Next. And when you look at the cities around the world that are performing at the levels we want, we find that the cities that we like and that work are flat cities, such as the one shown. And the most illuminating part of this diagram is that most of the transportation in these is in the form of walking and biking, and transit becomes ancillary and supportive of that walking and biking. And it's a consequence of the kind of form. Places like Portland and Vancouver are close enough to this form that the proper level of infill strategies supported by a transit strategy could get us there. But spending too much on expensive systems will never get us there. I think the next slide is my last one. So do the left, not the right. Thank you.
Jarrett?
So I was a little bit of a disadvantage, of course, because I didn't know what I was responding to. So what Patrick did promise me was that he does not in any way back off the views he espoused in his book, 7 Rules for Sustainable Communities. So to some extent, I plan my remarks in terms of responding to those. And fortunately, Patrick has included in this tremendously reasonable and self-evidently true presentation a couple of slides which indicate that he still wants to provoke that disagreement, so that's a good thing. Well, I'd like to do it myself. I can't. It's easy for me to just...
You don't need a consultant?
I'm sorry. There's who I am if you're tweeting on that human transit. So let's start with Mr. Campbell's investment. So in 7 Rules, Patrick tells the story of Mr. Campbell, who in the 1920s moved to Vancouver and bought a house in a district called Kitsilano. And the reason he bought the house is very close in district to the city, but across the water from it. A little bit difficult to walk into the city from there. The reason he bought it was that this streetcar was just being introduced. And the streetcar line was going to make it easy for him to get into the city. And many other people did the same. And so another great inner city neighborhood was born. By the 1940s, the streetcars had been replaced by buses. So if he had bought the house because of the streetcar, well, that wasn't a good investment. The streetcar was gone. But what the streetcar did was still being done. The service was still there. Very important distinction, crucial distinction. By the 1990s, Kitsilano explodes to 4 stories consistently. The transit is still there. It's still buses. So, and then by the 2000s, Kitsilano has become extremely fashionable. It's the sort of place where you see lots of signs of high disposable income. I lived there briefly in 2006 and can report that my walk to the nearest cup of coffee took me past 2 specialty maternity stores and 2, count them, 2 bakeries for bespoke specialized dog biscuits. That's the sort of place Kitsilano is. So everything, one of the things that occurs to me is that everything that Patrick has just said about the terrible unaffordability of the Tower City is also true of, in many ways, the classic transit city. And we're seeing that here in Portland as well. So, but the other key thing is that, of course, transit just keeps getting better in the form of ever nicer, ever more frequent, ever larger, ever more comfortable buses. So I disagree fundamentally when architecture and urban design thinkers talk about this urban form as a streetcar city. Because the fact that it began with streetcars is just a historical accident of what was around in the 1920s to begin building a transit network with. They're transit cities. They are built not around any particular technology, but rather around the need for public transit to be tremendously efficient. And they have, at their best, this wonderfully decentralized structure. Patrick and I totally agree on this. This wonderfully decentralized structure in which you have parallel arterials roughly every half mile apart, so that you're a quarter mile walk from one. You're usually close to a line going north-south and a line going east-west. The genius of the high-frequency grid is that means you can get from anywhere to anywhere with a single transfer. And that is such a good idea that transit has continued to improve in the form of continuing to invest in that. And as a result, sorry, could I get a time check? I lost track of my time.
About 3 minutes and 28 seconds.
3 minutes in, okay, great. All right, so that's working extremely well. And the continuous improvements that are happening in the transit system are building on the strength of that. What we're mostly doing, rather than putting in new lines, is continuing to speed up and improve the lines that are there, with ordinary local bus lines turning into bus rapid transit lines, and in one case, the north-south blue line there actually turning into a subway. But it's all in the service of that grid pattern, which serves that everywhere to everywhere city, that city where there's no one center of towers. So here's why streetcars are a bad idea now. So streetcars, there is this view out there in the architecture and design world that because this idealized moment in history, the streetcar was the technology of that moment, that therefore if we go back to that technology, we'll somehow get back everything we had. Well, at the time that streetcars prospered, there was almost no traffic. There was nothing to get in their way. Now we have this situation. And if you want to understand why not a single Canadian city has introduced new streetcars in mixed traffic, it's because most Canadians have been to Toronto and understand what Toronto deals with its legacy streetcar system stuck in mixed traffic. This basic problem of reliability, the problem that dumb little things that happen, just a car parked incorrectly, sticking out of the lane, immediately shut down the entire streetcar system. That's a pretty fatal flaw to those of us who are actually interested in people getting where they're going. Let's continue the history. By the 2010s, Vancouver has this great high-frequency grid, but there's a bigger urban region. And it doesn't matter whether you approve of it, it exists. And it's not just the Tower City either. It's that way on beyond the end of the SkyTrain line, we have vast, vast amounts of not really cul-de-sacs anymore. It's really inner ring, suburban, low to moderate income stuff, mixtures of apartments, all kinds of stuff out there. And at other times when I've listened to urbanists talk about this, I've gotten the impression that fundamentally they would like that to be harder to get to. Because getting to that means inevitably traveling long distances, and those long distances trips are ultimately, from an environmental point of view, not something we want to be encouraging. That is true in theory, but extremely troubling if you just begin designing your networks that way, because it becomes almost the definition of increasing inequality in the reality of a region where lower income people are having to travel longer distances. So, by the 2020s, over Professor Condon's objections, Kitsilano is probably going to get a station on a new rapid transit line. And that line is going to be excellent for Kitsilano because it does many things at once. So one of the things you'll hear when you listen to a transit planner talk, you'll notice me avoiding ever reducing a technology to a demographic. You will avoid me ever saying the buses are for these people, the streetcars are for these people. Because as soon as you start talking that way, you lead people away from the idea that no, all these things work together and they are all part of one network, and that is why it works so well. So the great thing about the subway when it goes through Kitsilano is that it goes to so many other places and it goes there quickly. It will be a vast expansion in access across the old transit city. There's already been one subway line built right across it, stopping at every transfer point, and it's accelerated movements across the city. This will be another. And it will also help connect these inner city transit city neighborhoods out to the suburbs where, for better or worse, you have the airport, you have concentrations of suburban jobs. Not everyone who wants to live in the inner city can work in the inner city. That's not where the jobs are. And, of course, housing for the baristas and janitors and everyone else that keeps the dog bakeries of Kitsilano going. Right? Because those people can't afford to live anywhere near there, precisely because the transit city, as Professor Condon and I would both praise, has been such a success. And unfortunately, the measure of success in our society is affluence and problems of affordability. So, why is transit planning in Vancouver not going the direction that Professor Condon proposes? It's because we're really interested, we transit planners are really interested in this. This is a simple diagram of what I call the wall around your life. It's an isochrone diagram, and what that means is I plunk my pointer down in a particular place, in this case downtown Portland. And it shows me where I could be in 15, 30, and 45 minutes. Those are the three colors. 15, 30, or 45 minutes. So the outermost is where I could be in 45 minutes. Now, this is not only a pretty good indicator of ridership, that is to say, this kind of assessment has always been inside of ridership models. And of course, we're not talking about the area of the map. That's always an illusion of maps. What matters is the amount of stuff in that area, the amount of useful things you can go to, jobs you can. Let's think about what this means. If it's not inside these blobs, you can't take that job. That job is not available to you. That shop you can't go to. That club you can't belong to. Therefore, people you will never meet. Possibly your ideal soulmate that you will never meet because he or she is not in that block. Absolutely seriously, this is what is at stake here. This is a map of liberty. So of course, again, this is the essence of just how free you are, and we want people to be free. So how we do that is to build a good, effective network, and again, grids happen to be ideal, so grid cities are in luck, but in fact, I've worked in many cities that are not even remotely grid-like, and we still try to create something as grid-like as we can, just because this decentralized structure is so powerful. We have to optimize over these particular things. I won't go into the math, we can talk more about that in my session. But let's understand how this collides with some of the vision. Sorry?
Robert revealed. Sorry. Bad joke.
Let's talk about how this collides with some of the vision that many urbanists, including Professor Condon, have articulated. And let's start with Portland's very, very bad liberty problem. No, I'm sorry. Yes, not that liberty problem. Our bad liberty problem is this. So here's where you can go if you locate downtown. I actually just went through the process of relocating my firm's office, so I've been thinking about this. Let's say, though, you're choosing where to live. It's incredibly expensive to live downtown, and that's because if you live downtown, you have incredibly good access. This access, by the way, is not nearly as good from the Pearl District, which depends entirely on the streetcar. This is a function of being right at the hub of the city, with all this transit radiating in so many directions. By the way, most of these blobs are created by using buses or by using rail and then transferring to buses. If you are someone who doesn't ride buses, your blob will be much, much smaller, and you're welcome to make that choice. Now, if I look just 3 miles further east, so see how the map's moving, the geography is the same and the map is moving. So there's downtown Portland, there's 3 miles further east, the Hollywood district, which might be a little more affordable. Now, look, I've lost the entire western suburbia. From there, just going 3 miles east, I've lost access to the entire west end of the side of the region. That is your classic suburban sprawl, high-tech region where there are, unfortunately, enormous numbers of jobs. A huge jobs housing imbalance, which makes people need to commute out there from Portland. The east side being the more affordable side of Portland, we have people trying to commute from the east side out there, and they have an essentially impossible trip. So freeways are all plugged, and the best we can do on transit is not very good because of this, because of exactly the thing that you have all seen photos of, about what is supposedly the most beautiful thing about Portland, which are these narrow little streets downtown with this beautiful light rail car ambling along at pedestrian speed. The problem is that light rail car contains people who are trying to make 30-mile trips across the city, and it takes them over 20 minutes to creep across downtown. So this is a liberty problem. We are trapping and imprisoning people through the inappropriate level of slowness and intimacy that we have designed into what really needed to be a rapid transit system. Which is why I think within 10 or 20 years, certainly to Professor Condon's horror, we're probably going to be building an east-west subway under downtown just to solve this problem. Of course, we'll still have the streetcar on the surface. And by the way, Portland is so over streetcars and so ready for rapid transit. A recent poll about priorities for improvement showed that Portlanders really understand the transit city and that it's not a streetcar city, and that what we do now to build the fabric of the transit city is frequent buses. When you talk to Portlanders about MAX, that's the word they have for rapid transit. So when 60% of them say they want more MAX lines, that means rapid services for the most part. Streetcars and mixed traffic, we are so over it.
1 minute.
Let me just go straight, I talked a bit about Europe, but let me just go straight to mine. It's the sort of key thing I want people to think about. It's not so much that Professor Condon and I actually disagree about any sort of statement, as that we're coming from different points of view. I appreciate Professor Condon announcing as a starting point that he's not interested in transportation. I am interested in cities and urban form, but I come at it from a transit perspective. And here are some of the things that you're just going to notice are different in the way these different points of view talk about it. A tendency to talk about transit as built environment, as a thing, whereas in fact transit is operations. It's not a thing, it's a flow. A belief that we should plan mostly for city shaping impact. The reality for those of us who actually plan transit systems, that yes, we are aware of that, but inevitably we have to be addressing the problems of the city as it is, regardless of whether we like that it is that way. The built environment world, which is very closely bound up with real estate, tending to inevitably lead to the notion that affluence is success. I don't think everyone believes that, but it is the premise of the real estate industry. Transit planners spend a lot of time talking to very poor people and listening to very poor people and thinking about how to make the world work for them. The assumption that transit outcomes arise from the technology choice, when in fact we think they arise from the design of the network and where you can go, the extent of your liberty. And finally, I think we talk more about this, the assumption that investment responds to technologies, which was what's there in the endless claim that the Portland streetcar caused the Pearl District. And there are two interesting questions about that. One is, of course, we can never tease apart the causation because it was all being done at the same time by the same people. The other is, yes, a lot of people invested in the Pearl District in response to the streetcar being there, but we don't yet know whether that was actually a wise investment, because they were responding mostly to a symbol rather than to actual measurable liberty. It is actually remarkably hard to get to the Pearl District on transit from a lot of places because the streetcar is your only option and the streetcar is so slow and unreliable. So we'll see over time whether true value lies in the fact that there's a streetcar going past your house or in the fact that you can actually get to lots of places. Thank you.
Well, Jarrett, I hardly know where to begin. I hardly know where to begin. And I won't get very far in my rebuttal as a consequence. So I'll start with the overarching statement, which I've made before, you should be aware of. It's not the streetcar, it's the city. And it's perjurous to assign me diminished status of a nostalgic urbanist living in the past when my argument is crystal clear and you know better. That it's really about that moment in history, in American history, which left us with an imprint which is still largely our city. Approximately 50% of our city is the result of a huge expansion of American cities during that period. And perhaps I am a little nostalgic because it was a golden age when people were able to go very far in relative terms and take advantage of transit, yet they had access to things like a home of their own. Actually, the American dream doesn't begin with the car, it actually begins during this period of the streetcar. And I actually think, and that's what my argument is that era is not entirely behind us. You seem to think it is. You seem to think that the whole region is necessarily inequitable, and people of different incomes need to be separated by vast distances, with the poor on one side of the region and the wealthy on the other side of the region, and the black on another side of the region. I don't happen to agree with that. I happen to agree that sensible land use planning, which Portland has tried to attempt, that incorporates affordable housing and equitable access to housing and intergenerational equity, can be executed at the district by district scale. So that an argument that suggests we have to have these vastly expensive systems to get us from one side of the region every day, every person, to the other side of the region, so that they can serve the cappuccino to the rich folk wherever they are, and then go back to their hovel at in the external suburbs. I don't think that's what Portland planning is all about. I don't think that is what transportation planning should be all about. I think in the absence of an equitable planning around housing, we're cooked anyway. So my argument necessarily assumes, perhaps idealistically, that we would have equitable access to housing. You note the unaffordability of Kitsilano, tragic as it is. Nevertheless, there are certain things that have happened in Kitsilano that make the baristas usually live in the same neighborhood. Basements have been converted into rental suites, expensive suites, but usually occupied by students or the baristas that you refer to. Laneway houses have been introduced along the lanes. The allowable occupancy has gone from 2 to 3 to 4 dwelling units, which is a strategy that I suggest. Have I used up my 3 more?
We have another 50 seconds.
Okay, and I'll just, I got a long list here, but Toronto, that's horrible for you to really pick on Toronto. So unfair. Toronto is the only city in North America that did not rip out their streetcar system. There's remnants in Philadelphia and Boston, but largely everybody ripped theirs out. Much to the dismay of people, and Portland is the only one that's making a substantial shot at restoring it. Again, it's not about the streetcar, it's about the city. And I think there's evidence here that that's an intelligent move, because the development of more affordable housing is following that system. You're creating walkable neighborhoods that don't require access to the car all the time, except when you're making that trip downtown by your expensive subway system. You know, that's a different model of city building. I think I burned up my time.
Thank you, Patrick. Jarrett?
Well, I didn't know that I was personally responsible for racial segregation and large-scale problems of inequality in urban regions. What's going on there, again, that's the sort of thing where it sounds like there's a disagreement and it would be fun to watch us yell at each other, but there's really just a different frame of reference, which is that, as Professor Condon has said himself, he's really interested in what happens 50 years out. And that's great. And I'm very interested in what happens 50 years out. But the votes are not there to do everything based solely on their outcomes 50 years in the future, because people need solutions in their own lives now. And the reality of how transit planning works then is that we are always aware of the city shaping effect that we are having, and we think that's pretty positive. But we have to be designing around the reality of the city as it is. The fact that the city is as it is does not mean I like that it is as it is, or that I am promoting that in any way. It simply means that I am accepting the need to live in it and solve the problems of people who actually live here. I'm going to go quickly to the notion that what I hear when I hear Professor Condon talk about this is very interesting, because he'll tell me it's not about the streetcar, and then he'll talk about the streetcar. And as he just said, that he actually tied the streetcar to affordability. And I think what we've seen in Portland is quite exactly the opposite of that. That when we spend a lot of money in one special neighborhood to create a special thing, we create what was really the intention of the developers, which was escalating land value and therefore very expensive units. And that in fact it is the large-scale frequent bus network that is able to, the key thing about the frequent bus network, and this is why I'm so adamant about it, is that it is the right level of quality that that it is good enough to be really useful and really liberating, and yet we can afford to make it extensive enough that it cannot possibly drive up land values everywhere it touches, because it just goes to many places. It's the crucial tool for reaching out into inner ring suburbia in particular, where we are starting to force more and more low-income people to live and to bring them back into the city. That's why I think it's pointless to talk about affordable housing. All that matters is affordable living. And we can make and that's a crucial part of how we welcome inner ring suburbia back into the city. So I think it is fundamentally, what is so fundamentally interesting about this is that we are basically agreeing on so many things. Professor Condon and I did agree about the glory of the fundamentally decentralized medium density city. He calls it a streetcar city. I just think that's a historical accident. It's a transit city. And it has been a transit city ever since, and it's continued to prosper and grow as a transit city, regardless of the technology being used. And I think we also fundamentally agree about where we would want to be in 50 years. I just feel more optimistic about the fact that we can find our way to the 50-year future by way of things that also make sense on shorter time horizons. Because one of the idea I'll leave you with is that if you want things to be a certain way 50 years in the future, it's not enough to visualize that time. You have to visualize the process of evolution. Because cities evolve in the way that species evolve, and the key thing is that every moment between here and there, you have to have something that's functional. You can't just imagine a jump to some future state. You have to visualize how that will evolve and how every step of that evolution will itself be viable. That's why I don't apologize for the fact that I care a lot about people's mobility right now and about solving the problems presented by the city as it is.
Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. So as is appropriate, there were some sparks, some heat, but also some light and some different perspectives. So I'm going to ask the first two questions. And one of them fits the theme, which is trade-offs with limited amount of money. And this question's for you, Jarrett. So Patrick showed a $4 billion, you can challenge the assumptions or anything, $4 billion for a line going from connecting to the north-south line out to the University of British Columbia, and showed an alternative with investments over a bigger area. So that seems like a basic question. How many people are served? Do you think that was correctly presented? Do you have a response to that?
There are other, again, I don't care what the technologies are.
Right.
The issue I have with that is that Professor Condon's alternative to running a single subway line is to turn a lot of buses into streetcars, which are already working perfectly well as buses, in ways that don't make them considerably more liberating in terms of the speed, and where you can get to as a result. There's a crucial thing missing in that argument for a transit matter, which is it's not entirely clear whether these streetcars are going to be an exclusive right-of-way. If they were, I'd be all for it. But I look at the streets that he's describing, and I'm not clear where that would happen and at what expense. So I don't have an opinion about that until I see what the actual transit outcomes would be. I do want to emphasize, in other contexts, I completely agree. For example, I think in the U.S. we're spending far too much time talking about single bus rapid transit projects when we could just as well at that scale be talking about investing in entire frequent bus networks. We just had that issue with the Powell Division project here in the city. We can talk more about that.
So let me, one follow-up, and then I'll let Patty respond, because it's a great example of a kind of choice, is, knowing what you do about that system, do you think with the $4 billion, that's where you would have put the money in that focused corridor because of the existing development pattern and access points, or would you have spent the money differently yourself?
Well, the proposal that's in Vancouver now is not to go all the way to the end of that corridor to UBC. It's to go just to basically the end of the high density. Mm-hmm. At that point, that is a very rare example of a mega project that I'm enthusiastically for, just because the problem it solves is so dire, and there really isn't another solution at the scale of the volumes of people moving at that density. But again, if we had talked about a slightly lower density example, like in our grid here in Portland, should we be improving a single line up to bus rapid transit, or should we spend all that money spread out over all the frequent network? I think I would be coming down essentially where Patrick is, but again, you have to separate that from the technology. What I'm interested in is just, I want people to be able to get to more places so they can have better lives. That's why I'm measuring it by outcomes rather than by technology.
Yeah.
Well, you've done it again, Jarrett. I don't know where again. So the cost of that transit system down Broadway, which is currently served by Rapid Bus, part of it is in a nominally dedicated lane during rush hour. Carries a huge amount of passengers, and I would think that given your enthusiasm for buses, you would be warm to the idea that there's a much less expensive way to serve that corridor, particularly because you have 3 or 4 different parallel east-west routes that currently are used for buses and you could easily accept additional capacity. But I don't want to get into that debate. I'm surprised that you think a system that costs $350 million per kilometer, which is roughly 3 times more than the Canada line and 5 times more than the recent Millennium line, is a cost-effective strategy to go 5.3 kilometers to dead end at Arbutus, a situation that I'm very well aware of. I'm shocked and amazed. I'm also shocked and amazed that, in your, I'm avoiding the word duplicity here, but in your,
You can tell which one is neither a Canadian, or they wouldn't be even talking.
but you celebrate the grid, but then you also celebrate this extremely expensive imposition of such huge cost, and then the necessary utility that would accompany that, which will suck the lifeblood out of the rest of the grid. So you didn't mention the fact that all the routes are now going to feed that corridor, and that there's a land use strategy associated with that where development will occur largely on that corridor, and the rationale for the subway is largely on the assumption that you'll have 100,000 new jobs and housing only on the corridor, and the rest of the city will atrophy. So I'm surprised that you didn't find the moment to work that into your response, but now you all know. This is the situation.
So, Jarrett, 20 seconds if you want to respond.
20 seconds. Well, just two quick things. Notice the description of a transit project in terms of dollars per kilometer as though we were building 4 kilometers of subway. What we're actually talking about here is extending an existing rapid transit line that's maybe 20 kilometers long, way up in the suburbs, into the center of the city so people can get to it. Also, what we're doing is connecting a transit line that comes from the east to a transit line that goes out to the south. There are whole suburb-to-suburb trips. None of that, you're not going to notice any of that if you focus on dollars per kilometer. What matters is that this is a particularly crucial missing link in the whole region's network, and that's the basis for evaluating it. Again, there are relatively few projects that I would be this enthusiastic about that are this expensive, but this is one of them because of the role it plays in the network.
Right, your questions, yes.
Right. So I'm hoping you both can agree on this. It's like the mama bear version, because we work in a region where we are Kansas City and we want to increase the frequent service routes. But we also have the network that we still need to build out, the network that we've planned for 20, 30, 40 years. So how would you agree on the ability when you have exclusive right-of-way for something more like Mama Bear light rail versus streetcar or frequent buses, that you complete that network and then continue to build the park? I hope you can agree.
Well, I guess this is the part of the show where I can come down on off my antagonistic platform and start to agree a little bit with my worthy opponent. I think where we agree and where I agree with you, but where I would nuance it is and maybe you are too, I guess, but I'm really all about the network and an even distribution of the access to transit. And I think a lot of our transit expenditure choices diminish that access to transit for many to serve a presumed few. And sometimes the commuters from park and ride lots out in the suburbs are the presumed few. Sometimes the office workers in downtown and property owners who own those buildings in downtowns are the preferred few. And far too often, in my view, those entities and those agencies become priorized in an unfortunate way that diminishes our capacity to take limited infrastructure dollars and come up with a systems approach. Now, I'm not a streetcar guy, and I have the streetcar city idea, but my next book's going to be called Flat City. I'm not going to talk about the streetcar city, because for me, the idea of a flat city, or a city that serves equally all areas, where jobs and affordable housing and transportation resources are more or less equally supplied, or more so than they are now anyway, is our objective. And what I was trying to get at is the places that function well, that I look at and admire, have that quality.
The worst mistake we can make talking about transit is to talk about particular technologies or lines as though they represent particular demographics. It's a disaster. Because successful public transit, the success of public transit lies precisely in the diversity of people who get onto exactly the same vehicle. And I have ridden every bit of the SkyTrain system all the way out to the darkest eastern suburbs that are furthest from Professor Condon's vision of the good. And it's crowded and it's diverse. So, here, take it back. Defend yourself.
No, go. Jarrett, you want to complete your thought?
But you know, I hear that, you know, okay, that line, that's about commuters into the city, or this line is about these people. The media does this all the time. Elected officials do this, because an elected official's model of the universe is demographic categories of people, and I need to know that I have taken care of a pile of these that add up to 51%, and that's all that matters. So we have to understand, transit is a win-win. It is not the case that by speeding up one element of the Vancouver grid, by making it into a subway, we are in any way weakening the grid. We are strengthening the grid because people get off the subway and onto the buses. People get off the buses and onto the subway. The act of transferring is how we demonstrate every day that all those demographic generalizations about transit lines are nonsense. Because I get off the train and I get onto the bus. So that I just change from being a train person to a bus person? No, that's not how it works. Think about the most successful transit systems in the world, the New York City subway. What do you see? You see the billionaire banker sitting next to the guy who washes dishes in his favorite restaurant. And that's because if we make transit real, the more useful transit is, the more diverse a group of people are all going to find it useful, and it becomes less and less appropriate to make any demographic generalizations about particular transit lines. And I think that is actually the answer to your question, even though we got all philosophical. You're dealing with elected officials who think it's win-lose, and you have to help them understand that it's actually win-win.
Other question? Yes. From Santa Barbara.
So I grew up in Los Angeles in the bus rider union era. What grade would you give LA Metro in their efforts to become a transit city?
I love Los Angeles. I think Los Angeles is going to be one of the great transit cities. I've said that many times. I think that there's no one player now. I think it's LA Metro and the LA DOT. I'm absolutely adamant. City departments of transportation have to lead city transit planning. That doesn't mean that the regional agent doesn't still run it, but only a city department of transportation can advocate for a city's transit system. Regional transit agencies are just too beholden to ourselves. And that's the case of LA Metro, that's the case of Edinburgh. But the genius of LA is exactly the thing that I think we would both praise, right? It is centerless. There are people going everywhere in all directions all the time in high enough numbers. It is, of course, mostly a 2- and 3-story city. So we have that density, we have that spectacular half-mile grid over most of it. It's a wonderful, wonderful city. It is going to be a wonderful city for transit as long as people keep clear on why you're always going to need transit, whatever happens with the technologies, because only transit can use space efficiently enough for a city that tends to function.
Okay, I'll use Los Angeles to segue back into a previous question. My slight or large objection to the direction you took in your last response. I agree with you that Los Angeles is a great transit city. In fact, it was the first and best American example of a streetcar city, or a flat city. So it still retains its 2- to 3-story profile, and yet, as a metropolitan area, it's the densest metropolitan area in the nation. So it's so close to those examples that I showed. And the city form itself, because of its homogeneity across the valley, has those flat characteristics of distributed, relatively affordable housing, or at least you don't have gigantic concentrations of wealth. South LA notwithstanding. That the distribution of jobs and houses and transportation services at one time was great. They made, of course, a tragic era, as archived in the great movie Who Killed Roger Rabbit, by destroying that whole system whole scale for reasons that didn't have to do with intelligent transit planning, but had to do with an economic development strategy that was organized around the automobile. Then lastly, the young lady in the back made the question about emphasis of networks, which somehow you interpreted my answer as suggesting demographic separation. That was entirely the opposite of what I was trying to say. Indeed, demographic separation is what happens when you have an overemphasis on one kind of piece of the transit system versus the other. I tried to show that in the slides what's happening in Vancouver. You're getting the emergence of 2 entirely separate cities, not just in the center city or the city of Vancouver, but also out in the suburbs. If you're within a 10-minute walk distance of the new transit line, you're in a tower. If you're beyond that, you're in a single-family home to some extent. This, I think, is more tragic in the suburbs than in the older cities, which were streetcar cities, because the bones of those areas are such, they still have a half-mile grid out there, and the bus systems are typically run on those half-mile grids, is such that they're ripe for retrofitting, and they're already attracting the jobs. So it's not a matter really of bringing the jobs out there. They're already out there. The centrifugal forces of job locations are already very dramatically the case in Vancouver. And the Broadway subway, yet again, and many other examples in North America, they expend money on these expensive subway systems to reinforce the concentration of jobs in one location for their own reasons. It's not necessarily a good idea to have over 30 or 40% of your jobs in your center city anymore, particularly with the service economy that's emerging. It's a better idea to have a distribution of jobs that's not so dramatically centralized. And as I've said before in other contexts, along the region's many corridors, and those are places, let's call them. Let's not talk about the vehicle. Those are places of movement and exchange. And they tend to arrange themselves in ways that are discernible as pattern. In our region, they happen to be usually conformed in the form of a grid on a half-mile increment because of the congressional survey done in the 1840s, for Christ's sake. So, we have the legacy of that form, but in other places they have other patterns that are similarly discernible. Anyway.
Another question. Chris?
So big underlying thing under all this, and was mentioned in some of the responses, affordability, whether you do that as, I think it's easy to sort of do that as housing plus transportation affordability, but the general challenge being that there's huge demand for people wanting to live in walkable places. There are nowhere near enough walkable places to meet demand. What is the role of transit in increasing that supply of walkable places so that we kind of get back in balance with the demands and the generational shifts that we've had?
I've been hogging the microphone, so I'll make a 15-second answer on my part and then give it over to Jarrett. It has been mentioned before that when you put a streetcar someplace, it gets unaffordable. That's because the supply of this stuff is so diminished. And I will also agree that it doesn't have to be a streetcar, although the leveraging effect of streetcar seems really strong. And also my numbers say that at certain levels of ridership, it's about the same amount of money as a bus system. But I will agree with my esteemed colleague to my right that other systems can do the same job. So let's just agree on that. It's not about the streetcar, it's about the streetcar city. So the association of transit investment being a negative because it creates value that pushes places to a lack of affordability doesn't seem to me to be a reason to stop doing that. It seems to be a reason to do it more, to expand the supply of that, whatever it is that seems to be so attractive. And I think it's very clear what is attractive.
I don't think I disagree with any of that, although I may be a little bit more cynical about the fundamental nature of the real estate market. In my experience, we get affordable housing in attractive areas only when we require it, and only as a matter of public policy, and it's entirely a function of how aggressively government is going to interfere with the real estate market, basically, to insist on those affordability outcomes. Meanwhile, though, when I hear your question, my mind goes immediately to inner ring suburbia. In Portland, my mind goes to 122nd Avenue. In the Vancouver area, it goes to Surrey. It goes to those places that were built around the car, but are now not working because, and are ultimately, fundamentally, so unattractive that only poor people end up living there. And so we end up with large concentrations of poverty in places that on the surface appear to be forcing people to drive. We urgently have to get into those places with transit. We have to do what we can with walking and cycling infrastructure. What we have for the most part are still pretty good grids out in those places. We just have terrible local street networks and we have terrible arterial design. Those have got to get fixed. But that's a great example of a place, it's not, we're not going to build a streetcar in the Gateway in Portland. You're not going to, what we need out there is, when you're in that sort of condition in your life, when what is urgent for you is to get to here and then here and then here, you know, your job in the morning, your then hit daycare, then get to your evening job in the community college. We cannot be trading usefulness for aesthetics. These people are not going to appreciate that. What they need is just extremely efficient, extreme quantities of extremely liberating transit, which is why frequent bus networks are so crucial out there, to tie those people back into the city and to keep them, and to make their lives possible. We're not going to turn, you know, inner-ring suburbia is going to be with us for a while, and it's going to be relatively poor for a while. And we have to make it humane, which is very different from trying to stimulate, you know, trying to stimulate the sort of real estate outcomes that we have closer in.
So there is evidence that doing something dramatically wonderful in a neighborhood that people love, like a streetcar, will both serve a transportation need at an affordable price, competitive with rapid bus, and bring a neighborhood back. Now, the downside consequence of that is if you don't put enough of that supply into the market, you'll only be able to attract those who are at the higher end of the income level. So then you get the complaints about inequality. My response to that would be, well, do more of it, since it's the same price. My big issue here, and I've said this before, you know, for Broadway, if the subway ferry would come along and just wave the magic wand and the subway would be underground, it wouldn't cost us a dime, that'd be great. I'd say, yeah, the subway. I mean, I'd lament the loss of street life, you know, at grade, but forget it. I'd say your arguments are okay. There we'll have a subway, other places will have other things. But what's behind my obvious rage is that the region only has a few $1 billion to spend on transit investments. And I would want to see that transit investment leverage a great city, not just in the center city, but in the suburbs as well. And I think you really can't. You suggested you can do both, have the rapid system and reinforce the grid. That doesn't seem to me to be what's happening. It seems to me, by making a decision to invest in this very expensive system, you're putting all the gravitational pull of city building energy along this one corridor, and that will diminish the energy of the rest of the city. So the rest of the city ossifies, essentially. And you don't solve the problem of the suburbs. And you don't even start to address the issue of the affordability and the diversity of the old streetcar city neighborhoods. So that's my problem with it. Because transit investments only start to stimulate real estate consequences, not in years, but in decades, and it takes 30 or 40 or 50 years for the consequences to be fully made manifest. The things we do Monday are the deterministic things for what this city's going to be like in 2050 and 2060. That's my argument.
So, your question was about rapid transit. It was, you know, the streetcar bus question was one of the things you were asking. But I think, tie it back. What I want to gently object to about your question, which is also my objection to some of Professor Condon's work, is you're starting from the assumption that when you look at this great mass of things we call transit, it's logical to chop it into rail and bus. And that rail is a category of things that has certain outcomes, and bus is a category of things that has certain outcomes, and that is what I object to. Because I contend that in the long run, ultimate value, once you see past, you know, the inevitable herd mentality of the real estate market in any particular moment, ultimate value lies in where could I get to quickly from this location? Where could I get to from here? And as soon as you draw that isochrone and start thinking about it in that terms, you realize it doesn't matter whether you're on rails or tires. What you really want the transit agencies to do is do whatever is most efficient in each corridor to create the best possible network. And that's the other thing that I want you to notice. Professor Condon keeps opposing, it keeps setting up an opposition between we'll spend a lot of money on a subway here and therefore we will not be spending money over a larger area. That actually is the problem with Portland streetcar. because the Portland streetcar is too slow to really be useful as part of a network. But a rapid transit line, quite the opposite. A rapid transit line is so much faster than the local network that people transfer to and from it in great numbers. And so you get the network effect, which causes the goodness to spread beyond the immediate station area. This is crucial in all of our debates. Many of you are probably having rail transit debates where you have this problem about people are assuming that all the benefits of the rail line happen at the rail stations. That's why you have to have a frequent bus network plan when you propose a rail line. Because you've got to have the story about how the benefits of this line in terms of better access spread beyond the station area and out along the connecting lines until they touch, hopefully, a majority of your citizens.
So I think we're out of time, but I think that was, well, let's hear your appreciation for our